Good morning. So good to see everybody today. Hope everyone's having a great weekend and a great Lord's Day. So glad to have each one of you with us. To our members, it's good to see you. To any visitors that we have, we're glad that you've come our way. We invite you to come back and worship with us anytime that you may have the opportunity to do so. I want to encourage all of you that can to be back tonight at 6 o'clock. Tonight is our monthly singing night and devotional. And those of you that have been here the last couple of singing nights, you know we've been having some really good singings. We've had a lot of song leaders that have got up to participate, and we've really had some uplifting singing nights, especially over the last few months. And I want to invite all of you that can to be back tonight to join us for that service. Now, I know this is going to be a great surprise to each and every one of you, but I am not a long-distance runner. Why are you laughing? No, I'm not. That's not something that I have ever had a desire to do. But I know that there are many people who do enjoy that sport. There may be some of you who enjoy running. There are some that enjoy it to the point that they even enter into races. They will run 5Ks or they'll run marathons. I know some people, I have some friends that will go out and just for fun. Like I said, to me, I think they're crazy, but just for fun, they'll go out and they'll run several miles a day just because it's something that they enjoy. Now, whether this is a sport that you actually enjoy participating in, or whether you're like me and you just kind of observe from afar, we can understand what all would go into being successful in that type of sport. The dedication and the endurance that is necessary in order to be successful as a runner is something that's not difficult for us to comprehend. And the difficulty, the determination, the physical stamina that's necessary, especially when someone is in a long-distance race, I think it's something that we all can appreciate. It's something that we can look at and we can recognize just the momentous task and ability that it takes in order to accomplish something like that. Well, in our lesson text this morning from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we find the writer of Hebrews using this familiar language, that of a marathon runner. Now, you need to remember that back in those days, the ancient Olympic Games were being held. Running sports were a part of those games then as they are today. And so they would have been very familiar with this image of a marathon runner, someone who is a long-distance runner. But the writer of Hebrews uses this as an example to show us what it's like to live the Christian life. Notice this text again. He says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds." Now we see the beginning of this example in Hebrews 10 and verse 36, where we are told that as children of God, we need to have patience. Now, this term that we see translated patience can also be translated endurance. And really, whenever we look at this example of a marathon runner, I think this term endurance really fits that image better of what we're trying to portray here. But notice it says that we must have patience or endurance, that after ye have done the will of God, you might receive the promise. Well, after introducing this idea of the Christian life being a race, We then find the writer devoting an entire chapter, all of chapter 11, to presenting some examples from the Old Testament of those who endured, those who remained faithful, and ultimately were going to be blessed. But notice this chapter tells us that these were individuals who were able to do this with such a degree of faith, even though they did not have the promise of Christ yet. They were still looking for the coming of the Messiah. They did not have the ability at that point to have their sins washed away, but they were looking forward to those things that lay ahead. And yet those individuals, even though they were lacking that confidence of the promise of Christ that we have today, even though they were lacking that, they were able to develop such a strong faith that they persevered so many hardships, so many trials, and have left us wonderful examples of how to run this Christian race. And ultimately what we see as we look at chapter 11, there's really only one way that we can successfully run this race. And that is, it must be by faith. This theme of faith is one that keeps surfacing time after time as we look at each one of these examples of faith. We have to have that faith that keeps us motivated, that keeps us moving forward until eventually we reach that finish line. We receive that victory. But we understand serving Christ is a lifelong commitment. When we begin serving Christ, we begin running that race, and that race does not come to an end until we breathe our last. We make a commitment that we are going to persevere in this oftentimes grueling, long-distance race. And yes, it is a course that has many high hills of joy, but it also has many deep valleys of sorrow and pain. But if we persevere, if we stay strong, if we maintain that self-discipline that's necessary, we maintain the motivation that's necessary, and above all, we keep our eyes fixated upon Jesus, we will be successful. We will finish this race and do so in a faithful fashion. But also, when we begin this race, we have to begin with the intention of finishing. You know, how foolish would it be for someone to start out running a race with the intention of, well, I'm only going to take a couple steps and I'm going to stop? It would be foolish. Why even begin the race if you don't have the intention of finishing? Our desire must be to finish, and to finish well. To finish that race and to do so in a faithful fashion. But here's something we have to keep in mind, folks. In this race, we're not competing with others. In this race, we're not competing to see who can get there first. No, you see, in this race, it's not about when you finish, it's how you finish. Because each and every person who crosses that finish line in a faithful fashion, they're the victor. They're the winner. They get that crown of victory. Each and every person, regardless of when you cross that finish line. But what I want us to notice today, here from Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3, we find the writer presenting to us some things that we can do that will help us to press on, to persevere, to endure until the end of this race. Well, first, we can get encouragement from those examples of faith. Well, this draws us back to what we've just seen in chapter 11 of all of these great examples of faith from the Old Testament. Notice there in verse 1, wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, looking at this from the standpoint of a physical race, now oftentimes, especially when it's some type of a 5K or a marathon or even in the Olympics, Generally, there's going to be many bystanders who are there watching, cheering on their favorite athletes. Well, this is the image that the writer begins with in this discussion of encouraging people to finish the race. He says, remember, there is this great cloud of witnesses there. But the question that arises is, in the Christian race, who is this great cloud of witnesses? Who is this describing? Well, if we look at the immediate context, it would be those who were referenced back in chapter 11. It would be those great men and women of faith from the Old Testament who persevered. But there are many today who look at this verse and they interpret it as any faithful child of God who has departed from this life. But they often take it a step further. And they present this almost as if you have every faithful person in heaven that has ever known you sitting there watching you and cheering you on as you endure this Christian race. But there's nothing in the Bible that indicates that to be the fact. There's nothing in the Bible that indicates that those who are in heaven are able to look down and watch us and see the things that we're doing and in some way motivate or encourage us from heaven. So what is it that this is talking about? Well, folks, it's talking about their memory. It's talking about the spiritual legacy, the influence that they've had upon us. And I'm sure that all of us can probably think back in our past and think of certain individuals who had a deep spiritual impact upon our life. People that are no longer here with us in the flesh, those who have already passed into eternity, but yet we still feel their influence today. Yet we still learn from that influence. It's like the Bible passage that talks about being dead yet speaketh. They continue to influence us and continue to motivate us through their example, through the example of faith that they set for us, that legacy that they've left. That spiritual influence bears witness to the promise of Christ. And it urges us to follow their example. We look to that great cloud of witnesses, those that we have had the opportunity to learn of, to witness the way that they live their life. And we follow that example. And it urges us to run with patience or with endurance that race that is set before us, just like they did. And as I said, in this immediate context, the writer of Hebrews is saying, you think back to all of these people that I've just told you about in chapter 11. He says, you've read about these people, you've learned about these people all of your life. He says, follow their pattern of faith. Look to that spiritual legacy that they've left behind and run the race like they did. They finished that course successfully, and you too need to finish that course successfully. But then if we go back and we look not only to those in our own lives that we think of maybe a generation or two generations prior to us, but we go back and we look to those examples that we read about in the Bible. And we see so many examples there of people who faced hardship, who fell on hard times. We see many that even slipped and fell into sin. But ultimately we find that they persevered. They overcome the hardships, they turned away from the sin, and they finished the course in a faithful fashion. They finished the race well. And we can follow that example that's been set for us. Secondly, the writer tells us that we need to lay aside every weight and sin. Also there in verse 1, notice it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Now I want you to picture in your mind's eye a long distance runner. How is that person going to be dressed? Well, more than likely, the picture that popped into your mind does not have them wearing blue jeans, a hooded sweatshirt, and hiking boots. The image in your mind's eye probably does not have them dressed like a soldier or carrying a large backpack. And that's because those who are endurance runners, like we're reading about here, they will wear the lightest weight clothing that they possibly can. And the reason that is because they don't want anything that's going to weigh them down, that's going to impede their range of motion and keep them from enduring to the best of their ability. But notice what we see in this example that's given here. Notice the writer of Hebrews makes a distinction between weights and sin. And here's the difference. A weight is something that is not sinful in and of itself. But it becomes sinful when we allow it to keep us from running this race to the best of our ability. These are things that if we would turn loose of and stop allowing them to weigh us down and stress us out and worry us to death, then we would find that we would be much more effective at running this Christian race. And there are many examples that we could look to of things in people's lives today that are weights that they are allowing to hold them back from running this race. We see everything from jobs to hobbies to leisure activities to sports to any number of things that stress our lives, that cramp our calendar, that hold us back from those spiritual activities that should be the most important things to us. But ultimately, anything that is holding us back from running this race with the type of endurance that we need in order to be successful and finish that race well, folks, we need to cut it off. Turn it loose, because it's not worth losing your soul over. But then the writer mentions sin. And sin, as presented here, sin always begins in the mind. Have you ever thought about that? Sin always begins in the mind. And so we need to be ready to judge those sins before they ever take hold. Before we ever allow those to exit that consideration phase and actually turn into an action that we're committing. I think James describes it very well in James 1 verses 14 and 15. He says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." So notice what James is saying. James is saying that each time we are tempted, we have a decision we have to make. That decision is done in the mind. We have a decision. Are we going to give in to that temptation? And are we going to allow that to become a sin that we commit? Or are we going to judge that and realize, this is a temptation that's leading me to sin, and I'm not going to give in to it? We get rid of it while it's still in that consideration phase. We keep it out of our life. And by doing this, as the text says, we can avoid so many of those sins that so easily beset us. Because a lot of times, folks, we just don't stop and think. A lot of times we don't consider the ramifications of the decisions that we're making. We don't stop and ask ourselves, is this going to lead me to sin? We just do it. And therefore, so many sins so easily beset us. And in doing so, they keep us from running this race as we should. Third, the writer tells us that we must run with endurance. We're told that we're to run with patience or endurance, this race that is set before us. There's two things from this statement that I want us to notice. First, I want us to notice who sets the course. Who determines how we run this race and where we run this race? Well, it's God. I mean, you think about it this way. If you are running a race, who is the one that gets to choose that course? It's the one that's in charge. You don't get to choose that course. Now, if you try to change the course, if you try to find some type of a shortcut, or you deviate from that course in any way, what's going to happen? you're going to be disqualified from the race. Even if you come to the finish line and you beat everybody else there, you're not going to win. That reward is not going to be yours because you have deviated from the set course. Well, God is the one who has set that course for us, just as we see there in verse 2. He set this joy before Jesus, the joy that would come from the cross. We have to remember that God is that all-powerful authority figure who has determined how He wants us to run this race. The course that He wants us to follow has been set for us. And if we're going to finish that course, we have to do it His way. We have to follow the path that He has set. Now, there may be times we don't like the course that He chooses. There may be times that we grumble and complain about things that we have to do. But if we want to finish the race, if we want to receive that prize of victory, then we have to do it God's way. There's no other way to do it. We have to stick with His course. And then the second thing we take from this is we have to do this with endurance. We have to press on and persevere. But in order to do this, we have to adopt a certain mindset. And that is that we're not going to back down. We're not going to give up. We're not going to leave that course. We have to have that mindset starting from the very beginning that I'm going to finish. I'm going to finish. I'm going all the way. Because once again, how foolish would it be if we start out with the mindset, I'm going to run 1 mile when the race lasts for 2. Or I'm going to stop as soon as I see the finish line and say, you know what, that's good enough. It would be foolish for us to do that. Well, this is the same concept that Jesus described in Luke 14, verses 28 through 33, when He talks about taking the time to count the cost, considering what is necessary of us if we are going to be a child of God. Before we set out to fulfill a task, and in the example we're looking at here, before we set out to run that race, we need to understand what's expected of us. What do we have to do in order to finish this race? Are we willing to put in that effort? Are we willing to put in the sweat, the endurance, and sometimes even the pain that's necessary in order to persevere to the end? Well, if not, then don't start. Let me say that again. If you're not willing to put in the effort and persevere, then don't waste your time even starting. Don't start that race until you're ready to run. Don't start, because it's not going to do you any good to start out and then drop out still within sight of the starting line. Determine that you're going to start that race and you're going to keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. Keep persevering until you cross that finish line well, in a way that is faithful to God. And we do that by having the proper motivation. And that motivation is what I want to touch on just briefly as we look at our last 2 points for this morning. In this passage, we find 2 sources of encouragement. The first being this great cloud of witnesses that we talked about there from verse 1. But the second source and the supreme source of motivation is Jesus. Jesus, when He was here on this earth, He showed us what it's like to run that race. He ran that race, He endured, and He finished in a proper fashion. And we see this faithfulness on display from the very beginning of His ministry when He withstood the temptations of Satan. We see it a little bit later in His ministry in John 5 and verse 19 when He made the statement, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of Himself, but what He seeth the Father do. For what things soever He doeth, these also doeth the Son likewise." He says, I'm following God's course. He says, yes, I've come. Yes, I'm the Son of God. He said, but I'm not the one determining this course. He says, I'm doing what my Father has told me to do. I'm speaking the things that I've heard of Him. You see, Jesus was the ultimate example of faithfully running this Christian race, of staying the course, finishing successfully. In John 8 and verse 28, we see Him again claiming that He was speaking only the things that He had heard from God. We see the trust that He had in God when He was hanging there on the cross, and in the last statement that He uttered, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. His faith was constantly on display. And if we are going to endure this race that's set before us, we have to keep our eyes on Jesus. Focus upon that example that He set for us. But also, as we keep our eyes fixated upon Jesus, we will come to a realization. And that realization is that Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. Another way that this could be put is He is the deviser and the completer of our faith. That course has been set, and He has completed the course, and He has left us an example of how to do it. Folks, no one has endured a greater trial than what Jesus endured. No one has ever lived a harder life than what Jesus lived. Yes, there have been many, many other people who have been beaten, who have been tortured, who have been tormented, even who have been crucified. But only Jesus was made to feel the guilt of all sin. No one else has ever endured that. But all the while, the text tells us that even while He was going through all of this, there was still a joy there at the cross. A joy. Because if you go back to Hebrews 2 and verse 10, we see that joy was brought on because through the sacrifice of Jesus, many sons were brought to glory through Him. Salvation was made available through His death on the cross. Jesus is the one who shows us how to run that race and finish successfully. But then He shows us the final reward of the faithful. Those who endure, what are they going to receive? Well, verse 2 says that He has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Folks, Jesus is now in the most high and exalted place possible. He is at the right hand of His heavenly Father. Now, while Jesus' situation is unique, while His glory is His, what we're allowed to see in this example is just a small glimpse of the glory that awaits us. The glory that awaits those who finish that course and those who finish well. Heaven's going to be our home, isn't it? We're going to be in the presence of our Heavenly Father, aren't we? We're going to be there with Jesus Christ for eternity. We're going to receive that glory. But folks, you can't run the race if you've never started. You can't finish well if you're still standing at the starting line. If you've never obeyed the gospel through faith, through repentance of sin, through confession of your belief that Jesus is the Son of God, and through immersion in water for the remission of your sins, then you cannot start that race. And our encouragement to you today is to do that. If you're standing at the starting line, start that race today by obeying the gospel of Jesus. And persevere. Stay strong. And receive that prize of victory. Or maybe there's someone here who has started the race. You got down the course a little ways and maybe things got hard. Maybe sin entered back into your life, or you got discouraged and beat down and tired. And maybe you've just sat down along the course. You've stopped running that race. Well, we encourage you, we plead with you today to get up. Be restored to the faith and get back on the course. Get back to running that race. But above all, I want each and every one of us today to make a commitment that we're going to run that race with endurance. And it doesn't matter how long we've been on the course. I know there's some that's been running that race for a very long time. And I know there's some that's only been in the race for a little while. But regardless of how long you've been running that race, don't give up. Maintain that endurance. Finish that course in a faithful state. This morning, if you examine yourself and you find that you've not been living your life the way you should, you've not been running that race the way that you should, we want you to make that known. If you need to start running that race by obeying the gospel, we want you to come forward and make that known as well. This morning, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come at this time while we stand and sing.